Today I'm sharing one of my favorite things to do with old desks from the thrift store. This MCM desk was only $20 at the thrift store. It was made very well and it was in great shape, other than some chipped veneer here and there. I don't get how they price things sometimes, but hey, I'll take the good deal. And I think this is going to be perfect to turn into some nightstands. First, I started how I always start makeovers. I removed the hardware and cleaned everything off. I used the scraper to get some extra stubborn things off, and the old finish just scraped off pretty easily. And inside one drawer was pretty gross. With all of that out of the way, I got started on the fun part. I took off the top of the desk. Typically, tops are held on with some screws or some nails. This one had screws in the front and nails in the back, so it was pretty easy. Then I had to figure out how to get rid of the middle part. I ended up using my Dremel multi-tool to cut the wood. I got it a few years ago and it comes in really handy for these projects where you want to just completely transform something. Just plug it in, flip the switch to turn it on, and then push the blade into the wood to start cutting. Then I pried the wood out, trying to be really careful to not break anything else. These were nailed in pretty well, but eventually I was able to kind of wiggle them out. Then I hammered off the drawer tracks. And then for the back brace, I had to do some more cutting. And then I cleaned up all of my mess. Here's what the desk looked like after I took it apart. Can you see how the nightstands are taking shape? Close up you can see all of the damage that I did, so I had to glue this piece of wood back on and then fill in all of those holes. This would usually be a great time to use Bondo if you can work outside. I am still stuck inside, so I filled it all in with quickwood instead. Yeah, I went through a lot of quickwood on this, but I know that I can trust it to hold strong and not sink or crack. Oh, and I filled in the chip veneer with some quickwood too. While I waited for the quickwood to dry, I sanded the drawers down to raw wood with 150 grit sandpaper and then 220 grit sandpaper. And I sanded everything else to make sure the old finish wasn't going to come right off. And then I sanded the quickwood down as well. I didn't fill them well enough, so I had a few shallow spots that I had to fill with wood filler. Before I could start painting, I needed to figure out the new tops for these nightstands. The old top was easy enough to cut with the table saw though. I put tape where we cut the wood so the veneer wouldn't crack or split on the ends, and the edges were all straight, so I didn't have to router new edges either. And then I flipped the nightstands over onto the new tops and screwed the tops on, using the original screws and the original holes. Then I used my nail gun to nail the back into place. Oh, and while I had it on my mind, I replaced the drawer stoppers that were missing. Now that drawer stops right where it's supposed to stop. Then I sanded all the wood filler down again and cleaned them all up so I could prime. If you've watched my videos before, you've probably seen me use clear shellac as a primer. This makeover is no different. I sprayed 2 coats of clear shellac on the nightstands, letting it dry for an hour between coats, and letting it dry overnight before I painted. The clear shellac just prevents the wood tannins from staining my paint, and it helps the paint stick better. The next day I mixed up some house and canvas in the color Industrial Blue, and I added some water to it to thin it out enough for the paint sprayer. I used the Wagner Flexio 3000 on this one. I think it's one of the best beginner paint sprayers out there. And it could totally spray this paint without thinning it, but the finish would have had a lot of texture in it. Adding water to the paint helps the sprayer spray the paint, but it also helps the paint level out better. So then I tested the spray to make sure I was happy with the settings, and then I sprayed 1 coat on. It sprayed so good! The finish was that perfectly fine finish that I'm always looking for, so I was super happy about that. After the paint was dry, I decided to fill the wood grain since I had sanded the tops all the way down to bare wood, and would fill some spots that I had missed, and caulk the seams. After I sanded the wood filler and the spackling down, I sprayed another coat of shellac onto the nightstands. I've had issues with bleed through after filling in the wood grain, and I could see some bleed through in the spackling before I sanded it down. So I didn't want to take a chance having those stains show up in my final finish. This time I only let it dry for an hour or so though. Then my husband, Taylor, sprayed the second and the third coats of paint on the nightstands. After the third coat of paint was dry, there were a couple of really small runs, so I sanded those away and then I hit them really quick with some more paint. While all of those coats of paint were drying, Taylor sprayed the drawers with some poly. This can of poly was dripping, so he wiped the drips away, and then he sanded it with 400 grit sandpaper when the poly was dry. Then he sprayed 2 more coats, repeating the process. When the paint was dry on the nightstands, we emptied out the paint sprayer's container so there was only a teeny bit of paint left in there, and then we filled it up with some satin water-based polyurethane and a little bit of water. And then I mixed it together really well. I adjusted the sprayer settings to where I thought they should go, tested it out, and thought it was good. But it was way too much, and I had drips all over. So I brushed them out before they dried, and when the poly was all the way dry, I sanded the poly to smooth it out. I did not want to have to repaint these things, but I wanted to get the texture smooth again. So I sanded lightly with 220 grit sandpaper and 400 grit sandpaper, and even a sanding sponge. Then I cleaned everything up and sprayed again. I adjusted the settings, but a lot was coming out still, but I hoped it would be fine. And nope. The poly ended up dripping, and so I had to brush it out and sand everything again. I seriously was so frustrated and so confused, but I adjusted the settings again just to test everything out, and I'm so annoyed with myself, but I had my fluid settings almost all of the way up. This sprayer is backwards from my other sprayer, so I get it confused sometimes. So nothing but user error right here. It was totally my fault. So with a lot less of a spray this time, I sprayed the third coat, and it worked perfectly. Maybe I should listen to my own advice and make sure my settings are where they're supposed to be before I spray. Alright, so before I share what this old desk looks like now, please take a second to hit the like and subscribe buttons. Your love and support means the world, and it really helps us out in this weird video creator world. Okay, here's what it looked like before, and here's what it looks like now. A pair of matching tall nightstands, perfect for a small bedroom. What do you think of this hardware? We wanted something a little bit funky for these, but the good news is that they can be easily switched out to different knobs for whoever buys these. Speaking of selling them, I have sold these types of nightstands for anywhere between $300 and $550 before. They do take a lot of work though. So that's it for me this week. I will see you next week.